sandbar in the river. Back then, the city was much more tied to agricultural activity. It was only when the city wanted to have some industrial space right next to the city center that they constructed Andre Sala as an island, and you ended up with it in its current form. Looking back far enough, it just wasn't there. It was part of the river. And that was something that kind of stuck in his head. How can I kind of bring back that connection to the landscape? If the industry is not there, actually is there something to do with the agriculture of the region? And then when he started looking at Andre Sala and looked at the river, he started to recognize, I cannot just look at Andre Sala, I need to look at the whole of the river. So he was looking from the Gulf of Riga up here. This is just a thing he did in an afternoon workshop. And he was looking at how the river has kind of always changed condition. And he was recognizing that might be something that he could start to work with. And his point of reference, his project, expanded to looking at the whole of the Daugava River, which went back into Russia. So he had a project site that was about 150 kilometers long. So it's kind of a big project. But that was crucial. He could not talk about Andre Sala and somehow working with this site in the river without talking about the whole of the river. So then he started doing the mapping, looking at how different things had happened there over time, and then started to establish a vocabulary, the idea of traces, of shifting, of connection. And he started mapping the island, looking at what had happened over time. And then when it came time to generate a building proposition, he was working with those same ideas. One of the things that was underpinning it was the idea of, I'm actually going to take Andre Sala and return it to the river. I'm going to let the river claim it back. But what I'm going to do is almost go in reverse order of what happened previously. And what he did was look back over the history of the island and found that the key element that started the whole kind of claiming of the river was the presence of a railway embankment. That was the first thing they did. They built this kind of embankment, really kind of built up the land and put a railway track on top of it. And that became the kind of key piece that he was working with. In this case, he's working with something that's very physical about palimpsest. And then he started mapping the island, looking at all the different things that happened there. He said, this is going to be my key elements, kind of an armature, a backbone or spine that I'm going to work with. And then flipping through that, he then started to work with that and thought about how he could inhabit that spine, how buildings might start to connect with it. All the while that the island would slowly be disappearing. And that thought started to feed into the technology he would be using, thinking about some sort of construction that was lightweight, on some sort of light piling that could effectively be screwed into the ground to support the building, and at a later date that piling could actually be unscrewed and taken away. And this was a center looking at, his project brief was a center looking at trying to revitalize the river and bring back its agricultural qualities in terms of food production and other types of production coming out of the landscape. So just a bit more image. Again, you can see that spine, series of kind of coins or kind of built-up constructions, and then a building occupying it. But this is kind of saying, well, there's nothing happening here. Very quickly, I can let the water come back in and reestablish the marshland that was previously there. And all of this is just showing a kind of sequence of things he worked through. The construction starting to become a bit more elaborate, going down into the lower right-hand corner. And then what I was alluding to before, this idea of this construction, very lightweight, you can maybe make out these kind of screw-type pile foundations. And the whole building, like the landscape was layered, this building became layered, this very lightweight construction that was going to get built up over time, but also could be easily dismantled. So that's one project. Other project, and this is, again, is by the guy that had the image of, with all the text and the bright orange house on it. what he identified was not only Andre Sala as a place to act, but it also recognized that there were some areas adjacent to the city that were being underused. And he thought, well, what happens if I start thinking about those places? And then this mapping, you can probably see that kind of shape that was present on the previous drawing, is more or less here. And this was him recording what are the existing activities in those spaces, or things that potentially could happen there that there's already infrastructure in place. So he's just trying to make sense of, are there opportunities in that space across the city that identified? And then started to come up with different functions, from water park to forest park to sports park, that we're kind of seizing or building off of those existing activities. So across this about 3.5 kilometer stretch of space in the city, he was starting to identify a series of linked parks, but not parks just in terms of the green space, but parks in terms of where specific activity would take place. And then the more that he looked at it, he started recognizing that across the city, there was a commonality about other activities in the city that might somehow link with the activities he's putting in the strip going across the city. And one of the things he started to pick up on was a tradition of timber products, timber construction in the city. And apparently, he found some statistic that said Riga has the most timber buildings of any European city. You know, it's just got a lot of timber construction. There was a rich history of timber construction, and that's kind of died out. There's still a few people that know how to do it, notably people that are hired to preserve the existing things. But he thought that there's something that's kind of missing. And while there's still timber production in the country, much of that timber goes off to Sweden to get made into IKEA furniture. And he thought, wait a minute, can Latvians kind of do something with this? And he, like his other colleague, he started looking back at the whole of the river, thinking about where the timber was coming from, and thought maybe something could happen that joins up what's happening in the city, the presence of these timber buildings, the disappearing knowledge about timber construction and timber crafts, and production in the landscape related to timber. And then he started looking at Andre Sala and looking at all the sort of activities that were there or had been there previously, different types of things like crafts, furniture makers, joiners. The university had done stuff there, all sorts of small shops, bigger factories, a lumber yard, a drying yard. And he thought, maybe there's something to seize upon. This was his own way of kind of mapping that activity and understanding these things might start to converge. And so putting together, as part of an urban strategy, this linking element across the river and connecting up, so it becomes something again of a spine or an armature, and things start to grow off that, notably on Andre Sala, which is the island there, so there'd be this main spine and things would feed off it. Another view of that, a bit more fun. This is a type of drawing that suddenly became very popular, not just in the MArch, but these guys did it, and then the next year all of the BA degree students started doing the same thing. The exploded axo, and then the exploded axo got turned into an exploded perspective, and then it just kind of fed through the school. And it seemed to kind of go away, and now it's starting to make a comeback. So these things kind of, a big wave going back and forth. Anyway, it was a kind of drawing he was doing. There's lots of text talking about the activity. He's not trying to fix anything, but rather saying, I can provide this armature onto which things can attach, notably connected with all things timber. And then his actual building project became a college for timber construction, where people could go to learn about timber construction. Meanwhile, there's all this timber floating down the river that they're making use of. And that would be a way of revitalizing the city, bringing back some of the timber construction know-how, giving people jobs. But it's not just about building buildings, it was the idea about making furniture, making bowls with timber, all sorts of things that one might start to do And then he hit upon the idea, well, actually, I don't need to build the college. I can get the students who are attending the college to build it. So all I need to do initially is provide a single hut, but then each successive wave of students will add to the university. So each one of them is going to build part of it, and then the next year it'll be a bit bigger, and then another group of students will come along, and some students could be involved in building the overall framework, others could be involved in doing finishing, others could be involved in producing the furniture for it. And so you have this kind of rolling process where each year it just kind of fed off it. And then what was quite fun was he was saying, well, that's what happens Monday to Friday. What happens on Saturday and Sunday when the college is shut? Nobody's learning there. Well, we've got all these nice little buildings, and there's some people that are learning about making furniture. Well, every Saturday we'll have a crafts fair where people can come and buy the things that are being made by the students. And there's cultural activities. We can take some of these things and open them up as restaurants or cafes. So he was trying to build up a set of activity, and it's something I refer to as generative function, the idea that we can put a function in place, but then other things can start to build off of it. And it's this notion of joined up thinking. Yes, I can have a college for timber construction, but can that provide a prompt for other things to happen? And then he really got into understanding how this thing was made. And there was a relation between the idea of construction of any of these individual structures and thinking about what it meant for an individual to fabricate something. So a lot of his work is exploring at a very detailed level, how do I make this, or how would a person make this? How could I make the technology accessible so it could be done easily, people could learn it, that it would be quite viable to withstand the climate there. But also, as part of that, he was starting to think, how will people connect with it? A visitor to the place, someone inhabiting it. So moving away from that panoptic view and trying to understand how does somebody start to connect with it at a much more immediate physical level, whether through its making or whether through its inhabitation. Leading to the last slide on that student's book, the idea that he's talking about this thing that he's crafting, very much in the context of the idea of how are people going to live in it, what sort of processes are going to take place in it, and how does that start to provide some sort of liberatory potential for those people. Can they somehow, through being part of this project, gain new economic opportunities or new cultural opportunities? So I posit this slide in contrast to where I began with Zaha Hadid's image of the kind of grand master plan. The way that he's thinking about it is, what is life like for that person here? Which you may or may not be able to see, but there is a person here in silhouette. What is life like? How is this thing that I'm making going to improve that individual's life? What opportunities are there for them this person to engage in it? Some more recent work, the image that you may have seen from the poster. This is a project done in Gdansk. Again, kind of exploded perspective. Arguably starting to get a bit out of hand because it's starting to become a bit more about image, maybe not so useful as a mapping tool anymore. And also at this time, we're picking up on some things that had started to happen in Riga and also the year before in San Sebastian. In Gdansk, students really started to lead us down a path of industry. So in the economic crisis, all these ideas that students may have done in the past, there's going to be a museum here, there's going to be some sort of boating club that's relevant to the people living in Bilbao. Later years, we've really fed off the kind of direction the students have identified. It's about how do we bring back industry. So some of the buildings have started to become a bit more industrial in character and program. You can see that. This is actually a thing that's about water treatment, but then using the water in various ways for the wider city. another image of that student's work. So there's been a bit of a turn 8 years ago when we started running the MARC program. A lot of the things we were doing were about housing or economic activity that was related to maybe universities or connected to some sort of cultural events. More recent years, it's been very much about these sort of things, the idea of how do we get some sort of local industry going again. So the final slide, I'm sure you wanted to hear, because I've been carrying on a bit too long. A critique of palimpsest. I think this is important. It's something that Immanuel Kant refers to as the test of criticism. We can't just put things out there, we can't just critique things that are out there, we need to turn the lens back on ourselves and critique ourselves. So for me, the question is, what are the shortcomings of this idea of palimpsest? One thing I believe is a danger of just reducing it. It can't just become things seen as simply about layers. Sometimes people talking about it refer to palimpsest as if it's only about physical things. And there's a danger of slipping into that, emphasizing that. And it shouldn't be. The design doesn't necessarily have to end up in the same layers like that first student's work that I showed. This guy's is perhaps a bit more of an example. He didn't go down that route. There's also a fetish of aesthetics, notably in the drawings. There was a point when we were doing this project in Riga where it was the end of term review right around Christmas time. I walked into this space where all the students' work was up, and in 1 second I thought, oh my God, there's a school of thought here. Look at all this. It's built up into something. And the very next second I thought, oh my God, what have I done? And my thinking was, it was all becoming a bit too samey. And there was a certain aesthetic that the students were getting into. Oh, Bob likes this. Do an exploded axle. That's cool. And you don't do it for the sake of just how it looks. The exploded axle was a way of trying to record multiple things that were hard to capture in one single image, and trying to bring those layers together and see what happens when you put them on top of one another. It wasn't just a way of doing a cool drawing. And that's what's happened a bit in the school, particularly in the BA program. Students just picked up on it as an aesthetic, and they didn't understand why it was being done. They just did it because they thought it looked cool. Also, there's a danger of kind of slipping into saying, well, all things are relative. They're not. Just as I was saying, space is constructed, there's an ideology behind it. Things aren't relative. There's very purposeful intentions behind it. One can try and be balanced in that, but you can't just put yourself in a position that I'm completely neutral. Even that represents some form of political choice. Also need to recognize in doing this, we need to engage with other disciplines. In our school, we're increasingly talking about economics, so we've started to engage with our business school. We have to have conversations with those students, with those staff members, because it's just part and parcel of the sort of things that our students are engaging with. Also, I'm not trying to suggest this is a new mega discipline. Hey, let's all do palimpsest, let's all do this multi-layered mapping as if it's the answer. This is something that's been working for us, but I'm not trying to suggest that this is redefining things altogether. And also that it's not such a grand manifesto, but more of a tactical manifesto. And by that I mean, here's a particular set of conditions we're finding. Maybe it works in this instance. That tactic, it's applied in that particular context. I'm not talking about a strategic manifesto where I can say, this goes everywhere, we can always apply it. I think that would be dangerous. One has to be, there's a right time to use tools and a wrong time to use it. A screwdriver is very good for putting screws in, but I shouldn't necessarily use it to check to see if an electrical wire is actually live. It's not so good at that. So you need to know when you're using the tools. And I'm just kind of, if you can't see this image, and if it doesn't make sense. There's a very well-known cartoon called Calvin and Hobbes, which I actually happen to love. He stopped writing the cartoon, but I think he actually does a good job of explaining the nature of life. He tends to poke fun at architects and artists a lot, which also endears the author of these strips to me. But Calvin is this little boy, 6 years old, and in this particular strip, he's having an argument with his dad. And suddenly, he's starting to see the world as Picasso in a Cubist fashion, where everything has multiple sides to it. And he's lost now, because he's trying to see multiple things all at once. And then the very last image, he kind of comes back to his dad. He's managed to pull the world back into a singular view and says, "You're wrong, Dad. There is only one view, which is my view." And I just have this here as a reminder to myself not to get too carried away in terms of making propositions, that all of these things need to be open to debate and challenge. So with that, I will turn it over to you guys. Thank you very much for your patience, for me going a bit over time.